Every minute, 1 million plastic bottles are purchased globally. Bottles that will further poison oceans, ecosystems, and bodies. Microplastics have been found in the placentas of healthy women. Think about that for a minute. We are literally raising a generation that starts its life polluted before taking its first breath.
Because plastics are not biodegradable, they break down into pieces smaller and smaller and smaller, and all of those plastics have chemicals as well. This is a crisis of a very big scale because the longer we wait, the more plastic is produced and the more the world has to deal with.
We are stewards of Turtle Island. Water is life. I don't need to tell you that.
We are rights holders and knowledge holders and critical partners in the fight against plastic pollution.
So all we want is health-based changes.
We need to protect our water in order to preserve, that life for future generations.
The microplastics has, basically colonized the entire planet, and it has turned all of us into sacrifice zones.
Surrounded by Southern Ontario's industry and agriculture, this is one of the few untouched forests left standing. Since time immemorial, it has belonged to Aamjiwnaang First Nation. The sugar bush season has just ended, and spring flowers are starting to show their colors. But the flowers aren't the only thing making an appearance. Band counselor CJ Smith-White and his family are doing some spring cleaning.
We did an action shot of me fighting in the ditch.
Every spring, this small but lively community comes together to tackle the big job of picking up waste. They see it as part of being stewards of the land. But unfortunately, litter is the least of their concerns here. Aamjiwnaang is what folks call a fence-line community, a residential area that butts up against industrial zones.
So this is the one that I know is measuring the benzene.
Lynn Rosales is the environment coordinator in Aamjiwnaang. A big part of her job is keeping eyes on what can't be seen. Daily updates on air pollutants are necessary for the community's safety.
Actually, it comes directly to our computers in our office.
Because for the 900 members that live here, accidents are not uncommon. Living with hazards and being on alert is part of their everyday life.
This was put in place as a result of last year's benzene crisis. That's what I call it. It was a crisis because the levels went extremely high.
Benzene is a known human carcinogen. This means it can cause cancer. In this area, benzene is a byproduct of oil refining industries. The chemical travels by pipeline and is used by industry neighbors that transform it into chemicals used to make plastics.
My grandfather was diagnosed with leukemia in his 80s. From the time we found out, he was gone within months.
According to the Canadian Cancer Society, breathing in benzene can increase risk of leukemia.
Right now we are in the Aamjiwnaang Cemetery.
Aamjiwnaang's name has spent decades in the headlines. They've become synonymous with the chemical valley that surrounds them on all sides. Not just for the Chippewas living here, but also for their deceased ancestors. There's a term for a place that has been given over to industry: sacrifice zone. In 2019, the United Nations reported that improvements can be made in investigating health impacts. Despite this, the community is still waiting for a long-term health study. In fall of 2024, The chief of Aamjiwnaang First Nation delivered this message at the Ontario Legislative Assembly.
It is well documented that Aamjiwnaang has been voicing our concerns for many, many years. When we had to call for a state of emergency, there's a lot of people that got sick. And for, I guess, the lack of knowledge of how long-term exposure to chemicals or cumulative impacts from other chemicals that are being released into the air, how that does harm people. And without having that evidence there were some who were not thinking that we were being honest or saying, you know, what we were saying wasn't true. That was hurtful.
Even before the 2019 UN report, citizens were already self-reporting symptoms they believed are linked to industry pollution.
Little yellow dot must have been that they died of cancer.
This 2005 APTN news story shows a body mapping project recording symptoms such as miscarriages, headaches, asthma, and rashes.
Ever since they were little, they would, get really wheezy and coughing.
Lisa Joseph's 5 children were all diagnosed with respiratory problems, including asthma.
Thinking if it's caused from where we live, and people don't know.
Although health is a difficult topic for many to speak on, a lot of these same health issues are still being experienced by Aamjiwnaang members to this day.
There's a lot of children have asthma. One of my staff has to be on oxygen 24/7 now, and she's had asthma most of her life.
This was determined an unsafe area for people to live.
Smith White is referring to the former village of Bluewater.
But it's okay for us to live there.
Situated less than a kilometer north of Aamjiwnaang, it was disbanded and relocated in 1966 due to health concerns.
And no one has ever been concerned about, do we need to move? Is it safe for us to live there?
In 1942, a Crown corporation called Polymer began producing synthetic rubber for World War II. Rubber revolutionized the petrochemical industry in southern Ontario, opening doors for other industries. What started as one industry soon turned into 60 and more.
And this was promised by Polymer when they were attracting industry, that they would have tax breaks, they would have promised lands, they would have little to no regulations, and they created the machine of what we see today.
Driving through Aamjiwnaang offers holistic understanding of what it's like to live as a fence-line community.
And in this bucket, there's been a benzene leak, and I don't know if it's still active today, as of right now, but I know as of a few months ago, it was active. So it just shows how old this infrastructure is.
He points out that the road we are on belongs to Aamjiwnaang. However, the land on either side belongs to industry.
I mean, we still have a little section of it that goes through here. Mind you that this is, there is pipelines under us as well.
Pipelines snake their way throughout Aamjiwnaang undetected. Their elusive nature serves as a metaphor for plastic, in the sense that the scale of plastic is far-reaching and not well understood.
When you talk about plastics, you have to take a big step back and look at the whole life cycle of plastics. There's communities that are affected by the extractions. There's communities that are affected by the pipelines that run and bring those products to the supply chain, which would be here in Aamjiwnaang.
Aamjiwnaang First Nation is just one example of a fence-line community. And the point of production is just one part of the plastic life cycle where Indigenous people are often disproportionately impacted. From the St. Clair to the St. Lawrence, rivers connect Aamjiwnaang to the ancestral territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka. Just south of Montreal sits Kahnawake Mohawk territory, what Lynn Jacobs refers to as a fence-line community.
My work, my research that I'm doing right now at McGill for my PhD is on plastics and all the various colonial aspects of plastics. So looking at plastic from the full life cycle, we've had a loud voice.
Jacobs is part of the Scientists Coalition and the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Plastics.
Over the last couple of decades, the scientists started to find plastics in seabirds, in different wildlife, in different environments in the ocean. And I think there was a growing realization that this problem was much bigger than litter. When we think about plastic, we usually think about it from when we already have the object in front of us, but there are so many impacts that occur upstream before that object gets produced. So we have from extraction of the fossil fuels, because plastics are made with fossil fuels, usually on or around Indigenous lands, going down to the production of the plastics and all the chemicals as well, the additives that are put into the plastics, through to the use of plastics when we're actually using the objects, to recycling. There are impacts as well when the recycling happens, and then the movement of the plastics around the world, the landfilling, the incineration, the burning.
See this road right here, there's on the right-hand side is the community of Kahnawake, and on the left-hand side is where the neighboring municipality, which is also our traditional territory, has put their industry.
Adjacent to Kahnawake, and less than a kilometer from her home, are waste management facilities. Although Jacobs feels the word management is a stretch.
Because plastics are not biodegradable, they break down into pieces smaller and smaller and smaller, and all of those plastics have chemicals as well. It has, basically colonized the entire planet, the microplastics, and it has turned all of us into sacrifice zones.
So what once began as an air quality issue has become an everywhere, every day, everybody problem. Yet even though microplastics are everywhere, our understanding of their health and environmental consequences are lacking. But that is starting to change.
Coming up to the experimental lakes area, here they're doing some microplastic contamination research, so we're going to learn a little bit more about what they're doing.
Of the 70,000 lakes in northwestern Ontario, this one is unique. Distinct enough to be studied by researchers, not just because it's polluted with plastic, but because of how it got that way.
It's a specific tool for collecting ice samples, so we call it an ice corer. Nice, a perfect core, yeah. Measuring the total length of the ice core. Total ice length is 40.
Desiree Langenfeld is a researcher at the Experimental Lakes in Treaty 3 territory. She studies freshwater ecosystems with a focus on microplastics.
We are looking at the differences in microplastic concentrations in the white ice versus the black ice.
Black ice captures a moment in time when the lake freezes just before the snow falls. Her hope is that the ice will tell a story about the levels of microplastic contamination. Langenfeld isn't just assuming that there's microplastics here. For the last 3 years, researchers have been adding thousands of small colored plastic pellets to this lake intentionally to see how microplastics move through the ecosystem.
You can't really see the microplastic in the ice with your bare eyes because it's so tiny and there's actually so little of it in the ice. By the time that the lake freezes, so much of the plastic has already sunk to the sediment or has been blown to the shoreline.
What about the plastic pollution and the microplastics was interesting to you?
I think it's such a new problem that we have gotten ourselves into, right? Plastic for many years was considered this great thing, all of this single-use stuff that you could just throw in the garbage after you're done with it. And now people are starting to realize, those things have consequences. And plastic ends up in the environment and it can impact the organisms that live there. So I'm really passionate about just having clean water and an environment that's not polluted by plastics.
Langenfeld recognizes that purposefully putting microplastics in a lake might seem counterproductive, but she says it serves a grander purpose.
In the past, these types of experiments have been integral to actually influencing policy, because when people see effects and things at this scale, people want to make a difference.
And what kind of policy changes do you hope that your research informs?
I hope that we can inform mitigation and risk monitoring, as well as reduction at the source.
The full understanding of how microplastics affects the environment is still uncertain, but preliminary studies suggest they are detrimental. With a recent study showing that heart disease could be linked to chemicals found in everyday plastics. The hope is that findings from ongoing research will tell us how to clean up contamination in freshwater bodies where microplastics persist.
We're doing this for 3 years to simulate the microplastics that are already in our environments today, similar to amounts that are entering the Great Lakes.
Studies have found that microplastics are present in all Great Lakes, with Lake Michigan and Lake Ontario being the most polluted. The Great Lakes contain about 20% of the world's fresh water and are a source of drinking water for 36 million people. And the most common type of plastics they are finding here are the same ones that the team adds as fragments to what's known as Lake 378.
The microplastics that we use in our experiment are polyethylene. This is kind of like what kayaks would be made out of. And then we have polystyrene. It is what red Solo cups are made out of. And then we have polyethylene terephthalate, or PET. This is a negatively buoyant polymer, so it sinks. And this is what like a PET water bottle would be made out of.
But despite its remote location deep in the boreal forest, there have been some Lake 378 surprises. After the ice core samples melt overnight, Langenfeld and her lab partner Francis Nuama begin collecting data.
Every time I filter a sample, I'm always amazed at how clean it looks when you're just looking at the water itself, and then once you put on a filter, you're like, oh, there's actually quite a bit of debris and contaminants in there. I'm going to place the filter. It's actually kind of a dirty sample.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what that is. Could be plastic.
Yeah.
There's a fiber on there.
Yeah. So we are always seeing other types of debris and microplastic that aren't necessarily what we added.
One of the largest contributors to microplastics are plastic fibers. Found mainly in synthetic clothing material, they are too small to be caught by the average washing machine or dryer.
So fibers are one of the most common types of microplastics that are in our environments. Because they're so tiny and light, they can travel through the atmosphere, so things like wind and rain and snow. And so that's how we can sometimes find these tiny microplastic fibers in our remote lakes.
How long will this stay frozen for?
Hopefully it's
still frozen?
Frozen for today at least anyways.
Dave Skeed is the cultural coordinator with Wajashkinegam First Nation. Near Kenora, Ontario, it's also known as Rat Portage First Nation. Before it was famous for good fishing and tourism, this lake was used for gold extraction.
So they just decided to go in, take out all the resources, leave the tailings there, and then take all the money and run. So right there you have people fishing for food to put on their table, and just across is the gold mine.
Water quality is a huge concern because fishing is a way of life that brings this community together. This ice fishing derby in March was done traditionally using a stick and line. But in the distance is the old mine, a reminder of the damage done.
We have to not only have to deal with the tailings right across from our community, but we also have to worry about microplastics. And no doubt it'll be negative effect on the fish, on the animals that live in the water. In order for us to survive, we need to access the fish healthy fish. If the fish aren't healthy, then we're not healthy.
However, it can be difficult to keep up with the science because the scale of this problem is literally microscopic.
Well, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? More information we gather to learn about what this actually does to the ecosystem, whether it be the fish, the animals, or us as people that rely on water, because water is life. I don't need to tell you that.
Wajashkanigam is one of the communities in Treaty 3 that began microplastic monitoring. It's one step closer to understanding if microplastics are another pollutant that's impacting this community.
It's our way of life to protect Mother Earth, and if we don't take measures to address those pollutants now, it might be too late.
Crystal Harrison Collin and her granddaughter Amara are visiting the Lake of the Woods Discovery Center. This pair bonded together not only by blood, but by language.
She reminds me to nourish that little child within.
Today is one of those days when she feels called upon to speak.
Bonjour, Shokiangatokindigo, Makwandodem, Wabagoni, Zagaigan, Anishinabeg and Doji, Wenongang and Daunongom. Okay, that's walleye. Uga.
Harrison Collin is a wife, mother, and grandmother, and a voice for the community, advocating for children, land, and Nebe, the Anishinaabemowin word for water.
As women, we have a great responsibility to the water and to the land. We are water carriers. We are the only beings on this planet that can give life. That connection from spirit world to physical world. We give thanks. Okay?
Like Skeed, Harrison Collin touches on environmental degradation and how it impacts Indigenous health.
Beside us used to be a beautiful forest, and one morning we woke up to a bunch of cranes and a bunch of bulldozers and chippers, and it was chaos. Here I was, I'm like out there, I'm like, hey, stop. And that man, he just ignored me, just smiled and kept on going, pulling trees out and throwing them every which way. 3 months later, my granddaughter got sick, really sick. We almost lost her.
Amara was diagnosed with a lung infection called blastomycosis, which Harrison Collins suspects was caused by the land being disturbed.
You know, when we don't take care of things like the land and the water, there's consequences. And we learned that one the hard way. When we hear that there is plastics or microplastics and even within our bodies, it's not good. No.
Behind the laughter is the belief that her work is challenging but necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Every spring, the Women's Council and researchers of experimental lakes participate in a Nebe ceremony.
We all have gifts, so when we come hand in hand, it's so much stronger. You know, whether it be the spiritual part of it, the scientific part of it, and you know, when you have those minds coming together, all those things, when we come together, that's so strong. So we're one.
Long-held beliefs are the driving force behind ongoing battles for the right to clean air, land, and water. And when it comes to those rights, a call to action is being made.
Canada has been a country that has raised language around Indigenous rights. I would like to see Canada fight for that language.
After the last ice core is pulled for the day, Francis Nuama joins in with the Experimental Lakes fishing team.
Right now I am fishing, patiently waiting for a fish to grab onto it. Yeah, there we go. So that here is a pink particle.
Nuama is from Ghana in West Africa. For 7 years, he's been studying microplastics.
I saw that microplastic is an emerging contaminant and issue globally, and in Ghana, no one has done that. So I'm like, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to be the first person here. Microplastics are everywhere. They are even in the things you think they are not inside. They are in our system. We are eating them. And currently, we do not know the impact of these microplastics on human health. That makes it a bit more scary. And this is how they look like from the field.
If there's one takeaway from Nuama's research on microplastics that he wants people to know, it's this.
So whatever we see in places like Africa might end up also in places like Canada due to ocean current and waves and other stuff, right? Even through the atmosphere, we found that microplastic can travel miles and miles of distance into places that you might think they shouldn't get there. Yeah, they don't respect any borders. They just even they do not knock. They just barge in and then make themselves at home.
The transboundary movement of plastic and increasing pollution has sparked concern, triggering global action.
The world is placing their trust on all of us to deliver.
It's been 2 years since an intergovernmental negotiating committee came together to end plastic pollution. It is most commonly referred to as INC, or the Global Plastics Treaty.
We are here because over the past 48 hours, since we started work in Busan, a staggering 3 billion plastic bottles have been produced. Every minute, 1 million plastic bottles are purchased globally. Bottles that will further poison oceans, ecosystems, and bodies. We are here because microplastics have been found in the placentas of healthy women, both on fetal and maternal sites. Think about that for a minute. We are literally raising a generation that starts its life polluted before taking its first breath. If that doesn't alarm us, what will?
So you've got a little homestead going on.
Lynn Jacobs was in South Korea for the last Global Plastics Treaty meeting. When she isn't traveling internationally for work,
this is Eddie.
She spends time at home with her goats.
Hey.
Living a sustainable life is a noticeable passion. Although she practices what she preaches locally, global issues continue to loom large.
This is a crisis of a very big scale because the longer we wait, the more plastic is produced and the more the world has to deal with. And it was supposed to be concluded in 2024, but because there is so much divergence in viewpoints around how to deal with this issue, they were not successful.
The objective of a global plastics treaty would be to protect health and the environment from plastics, including marine environment, based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastics. The last part of the text is bracketed for a reason, because not all countries agree to this approach of handling plastics from production to waste management. However, the whole life cycle approach isn't the only point of tension.
Now, I would like to give the floor to the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Plastics.
We are rights holders and knowledge holders and critical partners in the fight against plastic pollution. To exclude us is to undermine the very foundations of this treaty's legitimacy. This treaty does not just fail Indigenous peoples, it fails the world by also ignoring science-based solutions and full and effective participation in principles that are essential to addressing plastic pollution effectively.
According to the Center for International Environmental Law, more than 220 fossil fuel and chemical lobbyists registered to attend the 5th treaty session. This outnumbered scientist coalitions for an effective plastic treaty by 3 to 1, and the International Indigenous Peoples Forum by almost 9 to 1.
Canada has raised the language of Indigenous rights, but I would like to see them fight for that language. Ultimately, they back down when it comes to other countries opposing the insertion of Indigenous rights.
After repeated requests for an interview with Environment and Climate Change Canada to discuss these issues, they provided a written statement. They say that the Government of Canada has continuously championed the participation of Indigenous peoples in the negotiations of a global plastics treaty. And when asked how Canada will stand up to petrostates against Indigenous representation, they said they are committed to advocate for the inclusion of language that acknowledges and upholds Indigenous knowledge and rights.
I think it will be important that Canada shows strength in support for Indigenous rights in the Plastics Treaty.
But as a high-ambition country, Canada is up against more than just fighting for Indigenous rights.
When some of the petrostates and different countries the low-ambition countries are coming to the negotiating table for the treaty, we see that they want to focus on technology that essentially is just a band-aid solution. If we continue on the same route, where the problem is just going to amplify significantly and cause significant harm to Indigenous peoples that are disproportionately affected by the plastic pollution problem.
In 2022, a study found that Inuit and Nunavut have higher levels of chemicals associated with plastics than non-Indigenous people living in Canada, with concentrations being especially high in women. And with traditional food sources like fish being contaminated with microplastics, food has now become a public health issue.
A weak treaty is a failed treaty.
Phasing down plastic production or putting a cap on it is just one of the conversations happening. Even with governments setting ambitious commitments to tackle the problem,
I thank you.
Global plastic production is projected to triple by 2060. Because like it or not, plastic is a revolutionary material.
Plastic itself is inert, it's stable. In many instances, it provides benefits to a number of sectors, and whether that's aerospace, automotives, food packaging, that really can't be achieved by using other products.
We need to improve our competitiveness.
Greg Moffat is the CEO of the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, an organization that represents 120 Canadian industries in the chemical and plastics sector. His organization is lobbying for better recycling in Canada, but predictably, he is not a fan of the first R, reduce.
We wouldn't necessarily be supportive of caps because that's the potentially limiting the innovation and contribution that plastics can play in a sustainable future.
Moffat argues that a cap financially punishes Canadian plastic producers who need to stay competitive with the rest of the world. And because Canadian-made plastic is more environmentally sound than many other countries, Moffat says it's better to make it here.
Canada has really the gold standard for a risk-based approach to chemicals management. Right now, we're talking about post-use plastic as a waste. And what I would say to you is it's a feedstock, it's a resource. We should be focusing our efforts on recyclability, creating demand for recycled content. We are asking the federal government and provincial governments to create an environment that would enable these technologies to develop.
But creating an environment for technologies would mean taking a second look at current regulations. The Chemistry Association is on the record as saying that bans of some single-use plastic items will not solve the overall problem of plastics pollution and the management of post-consumer plastics. Since fall of 2024, the Chemistry Association lobbied government officials 165 times, and less than 1% of the time did they discuss matters related to recycling.
When it comes to plastics, we did believe and continue to believe that there was another way that would address the problems.
The single-use plastic ban is a direct result of plastic manufactured items being listed as a toxic substance under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, where a substance is defined as toxic if it enters or may enter the environment in a quantity or concentration that constitute a danger to the environment or human health.
The industry knew at the beginning that recycling would not be viable, and it goes back to the chemical issue.
A study completed by the United Nations Environment Program found over 13,000 chemicals have been associated with plastics. Of that 13,000, about 3,200 have one or more hazardous properties of concern with the potential to disrupt the actions of hormones, reduce fertility, damage the nervous system, cause genetic mutations, and cause cancer. Chemicals in plastic not only make it harder for consumers to make conscious and informed decisions, but it also makes it harder to recycle responsibly.
We don't know what chemicals have been put in each of those individual pieces of plastic. You fill the recycling bin and then you feel really good about it, right? You've washed all your plastic, you've put it in there and you feel good. You feel that that is the solution. And that's what the plastics industry actually wanted us to believe. When we realized though that after you put this plastic in the bin, we don't necessarily know where it's going and we don't necessarily know if it's actually getting recycled or dealt with properly. Using waste management as a solution is not going to help because it can't deal with all of the plastic that's already existing.
Plastics belong in the economy, not in the environment. And so we should be focused on a framework to enhance collection. But the way the federal government has chosen to regulate on this file precludes that innovative solution from being deployed here in Canada.
Despite Canada not identifying microplastics as a risk to human health, global concerns continue to drive scientific discovery. And with evidence comes awareness. And with awareness comes possible solutions. This is one of the final steps in the plastic making process. These beads are the result of crude oil being rendered into what's called a polymer. It's melted in this machine. Cold water turns it into solid spaghetti-like strands before being fed into another machine that turns it into pellets. Depending on what kind of plastic is being made, sometimes over a dozen other ingredients are added. But on this day, Dr. Arturo Rodriguez isn't making any old plastic. By mixing in a fiber derived from a plant, he's making a type of plastic that is biodegradable.
The beauty of this, we don't have to change anything in the technology. It's exactly the same technology, and we don't have to invest more money, and we don't have to do anything else.
Rodriguez is a research associate at the Bioproducts Discovery and Development Center. Located at the University of Guelph, Rodriguez works with biologists, chemists, and engineers to develop green products that can serve as a substitute for non-renewable materials like plastic.
The main objective now is to reduce the amount of plastic that reaches the environment.
How they see it, innovating new materials and the techniques used to make plastic could help solve one part of the plastic problem. This center has been able to develop products where natural fillers perform equally as good as their synthetic counterparts. The big difference? They use less synthetic components than what is normally used to make plastic.
These are also biodegradable.
And when it comes to single-use plastic, they've been successful in creating products that are 100% compostable. But there are some drawbacks. In 2020, the federal government found a lack of evidence that compostable plastics will fully degrade in natural environments. Products like coffee pods can only be composted in facilities that often face the same kinds of challenges as plastic recyclers, whether it be contamination or a lack of standard procedure to manage compostable waste. But in the 5 years since the study came out, the Bioproducts Center has had other breakthroughs.
Bale wrap is made of petroleum-derived plastics, predominantly polyethylene, which is non-biodegradable.
They are now making biodegradable plastic film for agricultural purposes, such as wrapping bales of hay, which could serve as an eco-friendly replacement for the 3,500 tons of plastic created each year on Ontario farms alone.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a place for those types of compostable plastics, but it's also, we don't want to create regrettable substitutions. We have to have a combination of substitutions for things where we really need to have a plastic type material, but also reshaping how we do things and not just assuming that we're going to find a substitution for everything and to maintain the same level of convenience that we're used to.
Purpose and the hope of these projects is to put some of that onus on industry. If we can show them and show policymakers what changes ultimately need to be made in order to reduce pollution in our environments and why that's important, then we can be capable of creating big change.
I think the important part here is that industry is seen as trying to do the right thing, right?
Doing the right thing also means minimizing impact on health and the environment, something Moffat hopes more businesses consider.
The chemistry industry's ESG program, Responsible Care, covers all aspects of a company's business.
For their part, the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada insists that all members take part in their Responsible Care program, where companies are audited by third parties to make sure they're complying with UN standards for sustainability. Responsible Care verification reports are then uploaded to the association's website so the public can see for themselves.
If you have somebody who's manufacturing chemicals in your community or handling plastic resin, you should want and expect them to be responsible care. But we have a similar stewardship framework on the plastic side, which is Operation Clean Sweep. This is about putting traps on drains. Resin pellets do not belong in the environment, and our members we're not required to do so by law. I mean, this isn't a regulatory requirement. Perhaps it should be.
I think the plastic problem is, even though it needs regional solutions, globally we need to also take steps into looking at mitigating these plastic issues.
But while there's a mountain of possible solutions for the future, presently there's a reckoning when it comes to the legacy of plastic waste.
It's evident that plastic is impacting all of us. So how can First People, step into their roles of stewardship?
I feel like raising this awareness, and especially between now and the next negotiations that will happen in Geneva in August, is to push your countries to be ambitious about this problem.
When it comes to Canada, they say they're joining forces with other like-minded countries in hopes to finalize a, quote, ambitious and effective agreement. But uncertainty that a strong treaty will be the outcome still hangs in the air.
Hopefully, we can, between now and August, there can be big pushes around the world to ensure that countries come to the table with courage.
And this courage to motivate can be as simple as what Aamjiwnaang did, sharing their lived experience.
We told our story. We sat with other nations, all of us tie together, and we need to really stick together as First Nations peoples to bring forward our issues on plastics. The physical boundaries of Aamjiwnaang don't stop air emissions or plastic emissions or land impacts. It's going to go where it's going to go. We have to protect our water. When you look at North America, we are one of the largest freshwater areas, is the Great Lakes. And here you have industry with so many dangerous chemicals, transporting it, under it, through it, over it. We really need to protect our water in that sense. And we're doing that. All we want is health-based changes.
We are stewards of Turtle Island. It's our way of life to protect Mother Earth, to do what we can to preserve what we have. And if we don't take measures to address those pollutants now, it might be too late.
Like if you plant a tree when you're 50, you may never get to eat the fruit from that tree. Your children, your grandchildren will. So I think it's the same idea, is that if we can phase down and eventually, hopefully, phase out plastic, I think that will be the biggest achievement that we can make for solving this problem.
All I know is that we need to protect our water in order to preserve, that life for future generations, for, my people like my grandchildren. Preserving and conserving water, it comes with acknowledging that water is alive. It has a spirit. It almost tastes better when you say thank you. Acknowledging that water is alive, because if it's, not alive, then we're not alive.